Thank you. So I'm interested in China, and I'm looking at use of technology in the UN agencies. So I'm obviously very interested in how big bureaucracies that are not very transparent use technology. And, as you can see from the title, someone this morning was talking about unsexy technology. Well, we got stuck with a word template, so I think we take the prize for the unsexiest technology we'll talk about today. So this project I carried out with Megan Finn and Nick Rabinovitz. We're all at the School of Information, and we were looking at situation report within the UN OCHA office. So let's get the acronyms out of the way. OCHA, United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It's basically a meta-organization that tries to coordinate all humanitarian actors that intervene in the aftermath of emergencies like the tsunami or like smaller emergencies. So whenever a state declares an emergency that it cannot address by itself, so asks the international community to intervene, OCHA is usually there to coordinate. And situation reports, CITRIS, are the documents that OCHA issue to basically take stock of what the situation is, so what is happening, who is active at a field level, what is needed, how's the response going, what is lacking. At least that's in theory. CITREP's issue, this type of CITREP started really in the 80s, so at a time where they were written on a typewriter and sent by fax. And the form has very much remained the same throughout technological changes. So here you can see an example of a recent situation report. And here there is another one that is slightly better formatted, but still the same idea. And this is actually from Myanmar in May. So what was the trouble with CITREPs? I should say that we started looking at CITREPs used by NGOs just for our own personal interest. And OCHA found us because they just went through an extensive information management review. So they hired expensive consultant. That was not us. And the consultant said, well, this document contains a lot of information that you're not using very efficiently. So you keep on gathering the same information and copying and pasting without a streamlined process behind it. So what's the solution? Collect the information in a form. That is, break it down, put it into a database. So instead of having your CITREP and then break it up and create a press release, report for the management, etc., you can just create on-demand reports. Sounds great. We are all for it. This is the perspective of the industry in the West, and this is very much what OCHA headquarters in New York would like to see themselves as. We are a big corporation, except that this never works. OCHA has gone through 5 attempts at reforming their CITREPs in the last 8 years, and they've all failed. So why have they failed? Well, this is part of the problem. If it's a very confusing map, that's good, because it is a very confusing situation. OCHA's mandate does not have clear boundaries, so all these ribbons that go around indicate the type of information that both goes into CITREPs and is influenced by CITREPs. And it's, the little fire in the middle is where the core of the emergency is. And then there are all these different networks, all these different channels of the same information for the great part that goes around. So how OCHA is supposed to capture this in a streamlined database? That's the big question. And what are the big differences that OCHA faces compared to a big corporation that would implement information management practices? Well, it is very decentralized, and that's not really the problem. The problem is that the offices in the field are pretty independent from what goes on at headquarters. So there is no enforcement mechanism. Headquarters can say what they want, but the field will do what it wants, and there's no way to make them do otherwise. Technological constraints, they're very similar to what we've heard so far through the day. Cultural and political issues. It's a UN agency, so it's supposed to represent very different constituencies, a very different political vision, and it's supposed to come up with the consensus on humanitarian emergencies that is neatly fit into a database form. That's not happening very well. And then different practices of data collection, and of course, accountability and incentives, or rather lack of, which is a big problem with big organizations such as the UN. So we took a step back from technology, and we decided to look at the process to see if there were ways that the current technology and possibly future technology could support better OCHA's goals. So technology really as something that leverages the process rather than hinders the process, as it sort of happens now. So we tried to look at what OCHA is trying to do with the CITRIS, who is reading them, what they want to do, and most important, the people who write the CITRIS, who are they? What are the fields where they work? What are their constraints? So this is our effort at doing transparent research. That's the slide for Kentaro if he's interested in going and replicate the research. We talked to a lot of people, and we did a lot of document analysis, which means that we read a lot of situation reports. And the findings were all related to really the process, how this process works. So this decentralization, the fact that New York is in one universe, the field is in a different universe, and this here was really the key to the failure of all previous efforts to change CITRIS, that the field was extremely afraid and wary of anything that came from headquarters, because it was seen as reflecting inevitably the view of the world that was in New York, rather than the view of the world and the constraint of the world that happened in the field, so in Nairobi or in Burma. Of course, New York also tends to forget that the technical infrastructure in developing countries, especially after a big emergency, is particularly lacking. And there is the extra bonus of often difficult political situation. I've talked about natural emergencies, but OCHA is also active in man-made emergencies or natural emergencies in difficult political situations. So, for example, in Sudan, I think the government is known for monitoring email communications of aid workers. A bit more about politics. One of the things that really scared people at field level was having a database with a field label off the record. In the idea of New York, well, if you have sensitive information that you still need people, for example, at headquarters to know, then you just put it in this field and it won't go to, to a wider distribution. And of course, this is a terrifying perspective because, well, it's not perceived as very reliable. The rule of 24/20 is very much in the minds of people at field level. 24/20 means if you do something that the local government doesn't do, you have 24 hours to get your 20 kilos of luggage on a plane and get out of the country. It's a great little rule. A practical example that we heard over and over when we were doing field work in Nairobi is, we were in Nairobi, which is where the headquarters, the regional headquarters for the Horn of Africa are for many organizations. So we asked people about the various emergencies. Sudan, Somalia, that's what we thought were the most important emergencies. Well, it turned out that the consensus was that the Ogaden, so this region in Ethiopia, was actually the most dramatic crisis, humanitarian crisis at the moment, but nobody could really say anything officially because the Ethiopian government is very sensitive and kicks everyone out. So no aid worker, no OCHA field officer will put any information about the Ogaden anywhere in writing. So looking at the process, we decided database is a great arrival point. OCHA has been collecting this huge amount of information, which eventually would serve as a great baseline for various country studies to see, for example, how emergencies are evolving, especially long-term emergencies. Are they getting worse? Are they getting better? We don't even know now. Is Somalia better now than it was a year ago? But it's hard to say. So as an end goal, database is great. In the meanwhile, we'll just stick with a revised Word template, which looks at, tries to get everybody on the same page. So instead of having 55 different templates, we just narrow them down to one, but keep it flexible enough so that it can be adapted by different offices and slowly move towards structured data that will be the foundation of a database. Just a final slide about lessons for ICTD, what we learned that could be useful for ICTD. Participatory design, that was very much the way we went into this project. User-centered design, participatory design. Well, it turned out to be very, very difficult in an organization that is top-down, as the UN is. It took us 4 months of interview and talking with people before we could get to someone who actually wrote a situation report. These are always considered like, the people at the bottom of the ladder, so not important, so not really worth our time, whereas we thought of them as the people who really needed to inform how CITRIS should be structured because they're the ones doing the work. And since OCHA doesn't have any way to force them to do anything, then maybe if we try to do something that they find useful, there is a little chance of success. The other thing is, what is information management anyway? Here we're talking, we're at the School of Information, so it's information. What is information? How you collect, how you categorize information. Information officers for OCHA are journalists. So you can see that there's a problem of vocabulary. So people are talking about different things when they think they're talking about the same thing. And, the context, as we've seen, there are very, very layers of complexity that, in this case, made CITRIS, are making CITRIS something less successful than it could be. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Putting aside the very last problem about people not wanting information to get out, did you perhaps consider the approach of not sort of developing anything, sort of any artifact that itself was centralized, but taking an approach of perhaps defining a set of standards for sort of the intercommunication of all of this information from the various players, such that if you could get some standard defined, then other tools could follow in order to share it among those players?
Yes, that's very much one of the ways we were approaching the problem, and we're still trying to approach the problem. The issue is that a lot of field offices are developing their own standards and are trying to get the neighboring field offices to adopt it, and it never goes beyond that. So there's this tension that there's no way of imposing anything, and nothing is really filtering from the bottom up, because there's this culture that I suspect is very typical of the humanitarian, especially emergency worker, that it's all exceptional, it's all a special situation that is different from anything else. So a lot of people want to develop their own template and their own guidelines and their own standards. So we're trying to sort of forcing this through the use of a template, so a template that has hidden guidelines and hidden common agreements on what things mean, what fields mean. But it's an uphill battle.
Can I just ask quick? I've been doing some work on different types of organisation that have very similar problems to that which you're explaining, perhaps not as extreme, but donor organisations themselves are very, very similar, with often the centre and the field. And I've done a study of a couple that had better remain anonymous. But to what extent did you compare the OCHA scenario with other similar kinds of organisation and try and draw some wider generalisations? Because intuitively there are lots of exciting ways that new technologies can actually deal with these issues, but there are, I think, a series of pretty clear reasons as to why they're not. And they're not so much to do with the technology, they're much to do with organisational structures and the like. So the question is really, what kind of comparative studies did you do in this? Because I think drawing out the conclusions are almost identical to some of the conclusions I've reached in a different context.
Well, it's encouraging to see that you're still working on this and haven't given up. But yes, we looked in fact at donors, because donors would be either a country or multilateral donors like the European Union or USAID. And donors have also their own little networks that has a big headquarter and then regional offices and country offices. So we looked at them a little bit, and we thought that it was best to not learn any lessons from that particular side, because they were, if possible, even more streamlined, even less streamlined than OCHA. We looked at what people mentioned as best practices in terms of CITREP. For example, the International Federation of the Red Cross. Their CITREPs are widely used and highly reputable. So we talked a little bit to the Red Cross to find out what is their procedure. Of course, they have the big asset of having local federations and a very capillary organization of information gathering at a field level. But still, we're following some of their best practices, and we're also following some of the practices of other UN agencies that have been slightly more successful than OCHA in trying to not reinvent the wheel.